Welcome to the Support Raising Solutions podcast, where we help new and current ministry workers grow in being spiritually healthy, vision-driven, and fully funded Great Commission workers.
Welcome to the SRS podcast. I'm Mark Wilson, Director of Support Raising Solutions, and I'm your host today, talking with Robert Ewing, who works for the Center for Mission Mobilization and is our Texas area leader. He's been in the Center for Mission Mobilization, mobilizing staff and missionaries to the unreached for about 5 years now. And he's been married for 2 of those years to Sid, and they have a new 2-month-old. And we're really delighted to have Robert on the podcast today. And our topic is going to be one that I think we possibly all can connect with and identify with. The topic is ways we unintentionally devalue ourselves in our support presentations that impacts the way that our potential partners view us as support raisers. And so what I'd love to do, Robert has graciously volunteered to share some of what this looked like in his support raising process. And without further ado, Robert, why don't you tell us just a little bit about some of your support raising process and the way that you might have seen this played out in your own story.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Appreciate you guys having me on today. It's a joy to get to hopefully share a few of my mistakes that hopefully can help others not make those mistakes. When I started raising support, I came from a background of my mom had served in ministry for 20 years. So I've been around the ministry world, but never around the support raising side of things. So I faced, some adversities there of just trying to wrap my head around just asking for money. That was a foreign concept for me when it came to ministry. But I think one of the first initial challenges that I came across was I found myself partway through my support raising journey devaluing different aspects of what my future ministry would be. For example, I had supporters for the first 2 years of my ministry that thought my entire job was to work with sharing the gospel with international students, which was an aspect that we always tried to interact with international students, but I work in mobilization. My goal was to mobilize believers across the state of Texas to the unreached. And so, but because in that moment I got nervous or what have you, I communicated to them that I was doing something different with the hope that they would be more interested in partnering or giving to me. So that was certainly one of the first mistakes that I found myself making.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, for offering that really honest and vulnerable assessment. Now, tell me, in your mind, as you're getting to that place in your presentation, what's going through your head that caused you to possibly even change or maybe amend so that they might respond differently?
Yeah, great question. It was probably a combination of things. I think for me, I struggled a bit with the insecurity of what people would think, coming from a lot of my supporters came from the same church, the church that my mom had worked at for 20 years. Everybody knew me, everybody knew my family. And I placed a pressure on myself that I needed to look a certain way because I wanted to look successful. I wanted to look appealing. And I struggled internally with just this dread or fear or anxiousness that for some reason people wouldn't value what I was doing, or at least not value it enough to give of their finances. Maybe they'd pray, or maybe they'd be excited, or they'd read a newsletter. But I felt that, man, if I want this to happen, I've got to spice it up. It's got to be exciting. I've got to showcase me, not allow the Lord to lead in this moment and choose faithfulness. And so I think that was something I really struggled with. And I believe I've watched others struggle with as well. Is not trusting the call that God gave them. That was something I had to learn. Man, God called me to this role. And I look back and I have no doubt now. I've learned that security but I wish I would have had it then, because I feel like I would have been much more effective in my communication, knowing that, no, God's called me, and this is a role that I feel comfortable and excited about. And I want to communicate that well to my supporters.
Yeah. Thanks, Robert. That's it's amazing growth that the Lord has an insight he's given you into that scenario for sure. And sure, you really did hit it. Like, having faith in the calling that he generated in us is essential. I wanted to jump back into that a little bit. Now, maybe in your own mind, like, what do you think? Did you think they had presumptions about what kind of ministry they would give to most? I mean, like, where did that come from? Like, or where did you get that idea from, that maybe there was something people were willing to give to more than what you were doing?
Yeah. Well, I won't name names for the sake of if they ever listen to this podcast, but I had people that expressed doubt in my sport raising process, or me choosing to work in a ministry that required me to raise my finances. Because I had people ask, "Oh, why not just work for a church or apply to be a missions pastor? You could do the same thing, but the church would pay your salary." And honestly, that a lot of days made a lot of sense. It's like, man, you're right. I could make the same money and not have to worry about meeting with 100 people. And so I early on had just some doubts from that. And that kind of played in the back of my mind, to where I think I portrayed that onto, or projected that onto my potential supporters in meetings of, man, what if they're thinking the same thing? What if they're sitting there going, man, this guy's passionate, but he could do this for the church too. And so I learned, and I grew, and I learned how to communicate the importance of me being able to do this full time. Not having to, working for a church is beautiful and wonderful, but I believed that God was calling me to work with all churches, all believers, not working for one congregation, and that might come, but I had to learn to remove some of those doubts from my mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think you nailed it. I mean, these conversations always go really fun places, but I think you highlighted one of the questions I had was, where do they start from? And you actually really did a nice job of articulating that it's voiced by a person who questions, and that sort of lays a seed in your mind. And then you start to, like what I heard you say, is start to project it onto other people. And I wonder if everybody's thinking that way. And so for the audience, I just want you guys to recognize the power in what Robert just said is, sometimes the voice of one person feels like the voice of 10 or 20, and it really does root. And so it can cause you to start questioning, what if everybody thinks that way?
Yeah. And I had some really good advice from my mom, actually. And that helped me kind of identify this as well. And hopefully this is helpful to some, is my mom had to point out, she has the wealth of experience of being in ministry 20 years. And she told me, she said, the moment that you said yes, the moment that you signed on the dotted line to join the CMM, the enemy drew a target on your back. That's not to puff up my pride of now I'm an important person, but the enemy doesn't want me to succeed. He wants to nip this in the bud before I even get off the runway. And what better way to do that than to amplify those doubts that, maybe it's just one person, but maybe that person has influence over your life. Maybe they have built a good relationship. Maybe it's a significant other or a family member. And the enemy is going to use that doubt. He's going to amplify it to try and discourage you from that ministry pursuit.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty sound strategy. The enemy gets you to defeat yourself, right?
Exactly.
He's like, hey, let me plant this doubt or hesitation in your mind, and then it impacts everything you do. And so, man, it's he's a sneaky one for sure. And your mom really nailed it. Well, as you moved on, did you notice? I mean, what were some things you were able to do that made a difference in the way you presented? Like, how did you right the ship or get back to your calling so you had confidence and conviction about what you were doing?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that came to mind as I was thinking through this earlier today. The first was, for me, at least, I can't speak to every person's journey, but I know for me, once I found kind of my anchor point in my story, in my heart, what I mean by that is in all my support meetings, they kind of wander to the same type of point, to the same aspects of my call. But there's always one specific part of my story and my journey that I always share, because to me, that is the anchor point. That communicates the why in my heart that I'm joining this ministry, why I feel the Lord's called me to this. And I believe that communicates the confidence to potential supporters, but I think it also serves me really well because I still go back to it 5 years later of, no, that's the point. That's the point in time where I knew the Lord was calling me to this. And that's why I feel confident to pursue this ministry. So I think that was having that anchor point, having something to really ground yourself has served me really well, at least.
Yeah. Thanks. Can you share what like quickly, what is the anchor point, man? Like, because I think people need to know what, like, so they can search for their anchor point, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, it was on a short-term trip. We call it a vision trip with the CMM, and found myself in East Asia. And while there, had a conversation with two Buddhists. I was talking with them through some translators. We were asking them, who do you follow? What's your monk? What does your monk teach? What does he believe? And they were telling us about it, and it was interesting, and it was very broken conversation, but they returned the favor and asked us, who do you follow? Which, of course, was the whole reason I asked the questions. I wanted it to come back to me so that I could answer that. And I just very simply said, we follow a man named Jesus. And they looked at me. They looked around the room. Our whole group was there, and they pointed to the oldest guy in our group and said, "Is that him?" And to me, I kind of chuckled and was in shock, and it just kind of shook me to my core that these two men truly had no idea who Jesus was. And I walked away from that as kind of my anchor point and my calling to go, God, if this is the reality for 3 billion people around the world, I have to help. And I know I can't reach 3 billion on my own. So that means I want to help mobilize. And that's what anchored my calling, gave me my anchor point as I went into ministry was, okay, my role for this season of life, however long the Lord will use me, is to mobilize people to that. So it was a fun moment, and I could replay it vividly in my head every day if I need to.
Yep. So it really was a point of clarity in your calling where you saw the need about who needed to go and how they needed to get there, which was the justification for mobilization, is that somebody different than you, we need the 80% of the world that only sends 20% of missionaries to go. I mean, that's terminology we use in-house here at the CMM, but yeah, that's a really cool thing. Anything else you wanted to add to that, or, just it was clarifying for you that kind of really.
Yeah, I think something more universal, as I was thinking through just examples. You asked the question, how can we kind of shift our view? How can we begin to speak with some conviction about our ministry, about our reason to join ministry? And one of the things that came to mind that I could see this being beneficial no matter what your role is in ministry is having a couple of stories, one or two stories from, quote unquote, the field. From your organization, from a coworker, from a close friend, that can show the potential supporter, maybe some of the fruit of the ministry. And that's not to go, hey, here's all the amazing things that will happen. But, say you're an admin or an operations staff and you're not going to be on the field. That might be a really hard place to find yourself. But having those couple of stories helps you to articulate, here's why I do what I do. I help run our organization's finances so that our hundreds of missionaries overseas can have these types of conversations. Because if I don't do my job, they don't get paid. They can't pay their rent. They can't buy food. They come home. Yep. And that's a really, really powerful way to connect the dots for somebody as they're trying to wrap their mind around, okay, but what is your role in this? And I just found that a very helpful thing to be able to segue into talking about, your potential supporters or your ministry partners. They're the linchpin for how you can do ministry, and being able to show them that, give them a reality of, you guys are the reason that those types of future stories will be told. And I've always found that to be very powerful.
Man, that's a great point. And I love I was in another organization besides the CMM, and when people told stories, they were their ministry stories, and it was about their ministry. One of the things I really have been enamored with at the Center for Mission Mobilization is our do your part, own the whole, and that everybody in the building will share a story, whether they were on the field or not, because they know they contributed to it in some way, whether it's our IT team, our creative team, our finance team. They actually they feel like they're doing the work out there, and there is no hierarchy, no second class missionaries, so to speak. And so I love what you shared there. And for many of you in the audience, I want you to hear that there is no such thing as a second class worker. Everybody's on the same team, man. So let's transition a little bit, Robert, and you did a little bit of that already, but what are some of the ways that maybe you and I can talk about to identify when we're using devaluing talk or descriptions in our support presentations?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I've always tried to check myself or revisit things that kind of identify some of those, some of that devaluing language, so to speak, is I had a support coach, somebody that sometimes in CMM, our organization, we assign a current staff member to a support raising employee. But at the time, I actually asked my grandparents. Funny enough, they've been absolute champions of mine ever since I started ministry. And I just asked them, I said, hey, would you guys check in on me? And they did that. They kept up. They made sure I followed up through with appointments. But I also used them to kind of retell my support appointment every now and then. And they would provide me with feedback of, hey, you kind of said the same thing 2 times over, or hey, this or that, or hey, here's a thing to think about. And that proved really beneficial for me, because I was able to hear things that I don't normally hear, or I was missing that I was already talking about. So I think that is one thing, having somebody that can kind of be your sounding board, that's removed from the situation, or is honest enough to be able to tell you, hey, don't sell yourself short. Like, what you're doing is needed and called for.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Robert. And, I think a safe, honest sounding board is really helpful tool for people. On my end, I was just thinking through, I wondered how often each of you guys out in the audience listening today, have you evaluated those doubts, where they came from and who spoke them? Like, just, like those things that you wonder about when you're presenting, and they often come in the form of fear for me. Like, will anybody really give to a guy that's teaching people to raise funding? Or will people, I'm in the States at a headquarters position, or I'm actually just leading a division. I'm not actually doing the work, so all of those things, those were the voices that were in my head. That even now I'm wondering, like, wow, I don't know that I've directly gone back and addressed what those people have said and how does it relate with my particular calling, like you said earlier. And you guys, for the audience, I just wonder, I want you to think through in your own heads, like, what are the ways you say, like, I'm just a youth worker, or my old organization, we used to call ourselves Missions Light because we were overseas, but we worked with Americans. Well, that's not true, right?
No.
And so, but I think we say those kinds of things. So I'm hoping in your brains, you're thinking through, oh, wow, where did those come from and how do I address them? What are some other thoughts that you might have, Robert, on what we can do? Like how do you address it with your calling? What are some things our audience can do maybe to kind of engage those doubts?
Man, one of the things I did I didn't do it early on, which led to some of my supporters having the confusion of what I did. But after maybe the first month of support raising, I realized that the support raising process for me had become me. It had become me operating out of my power, out of my expertise of refining and repeating and practicing my support presentation over and over and over again, to where I felt like I could say it, with my eyes closed. And I realized the Holy Spirit convicted me that I had removed the Spirit and the Lord from that process. And so I slowed down and I began to get to every appointment 5 minutes early. I played the same worship song every time. And I spent 5 minutes in just some prayer and worship and trying to remove myself from the equation, in the sense that this money that I'm hoping to raise is not so that I can have a good salary. The money I'm trying to raise is going to be used to amplify and lift up the kingdom. And I think that really helps me gain a lot of confidence. From that point on, my support raising was my personal experience, moved very quickly from there, because I truly believe that once I started to remove myself and get out of my own way, and I let the Lord lead, that I saw the Lord do some really incredible things as far as supporters that I got at that point in time.
I love that, I didn't really know, we didn't script this question, but I love that you went to spiritually healthy. Like, that's the move you went. You're like, I made a pause to engage the Lord as my confidence, with some music, with some prayer before the meeting, to depend on him. That really is the end all be all answer, right?
That's the Jesus answer, but it's true.
Well, and it doesn't devalue it at all, but it just but that pause that you created, it reset your heart, I think. But that's really excellent stuff.
Yeah, and I liken it to this, I think we can all relate to at least this example of, you come home from a long day of work, or if you're a college student joining ministry, you had a test that day, you were studying all day, life was hitting you all day, and you come home and you can either just lay on the couch, or you can find a way to kind of reset, kind of clear your mind, kind of get with the Holy Spirit. And you have a very different end to your day. And I started to realize that with my support appointments, essentially, was I was bringing all of life with me into those moments, and I was not allowing room for or inviting the Spirit into that. And so that became a very key part of my support raising strategy.
Yeah, great. Definitely Spirit-led guidance there for our listeners. Well, let me ask another question. What might we replace some of our devaluing talk? Like, I'm just an admin. I'm only working in the US. I'm at a headquarters. I'm a translator. I'm not really doing, what would we replace those kinds of statements with that communicates the confidence in our calling? Like, what kind of phrases or words might you suggest to some of our audience?
Man. Yeah, I'll be curious to get your thoughts as well, because you have much more experience in the coaching side of things than I do. But I think for me, some of the words and phrases, beginning to talk in terms, for me at least, was talking in terms of connecting the dots. Or I talk about how for me, I've only worked in ministry in Texas, but I always tried to show the pipeline or the steps that would get the gospel from Texas to Nepal, or Texas to the unreached. And being able to, instead of saying, well, I'm just trying to work here with churches in Texas, trying to do my best, downplaying what I do, instead trying to reorient the conversation on the kingdom, trying to point it back towards, hey, yeah, I do play just, quote unquote, just a role in Texas, but I believe that role is a key part of the kingdom. I'm confident that the Lord has called me to this, and as a result, I believe that people are going to go to the nations. And thankfully, the Lord has been gracious, and we've been able to see that happen. But I'm curious what your thoughts of it would be as you've probably had this question come up quite a bit with different folks.
It came up. I mean, maybe not as much as I thought, but it did come up a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked it, and it really stirred a thought in me, and which led to this podcast. But the resounding part is there's the need, right? That's what we focus on. We replace, I'm just with this is the need, and the need is based on God's vision, which is what he does. He can transform and make it different. And then I play a very specific part in fulfilling the vision that God has. And then at somewhere I really have to have confidence in my calling, like you shared so clearly, that I play a part. Like, and we believe our theology about scripture, that every part of the body has a function, and that there really is no part that's worth more than the others. And so really it's going back to my role is essential because, and here's how I help the gospel get to the nations. And I may be a small intestine or a stomach or, like whatever that version, but the body doesn't function without me. And so there's just like, God has placed incredible value in it. So I wonder for you, I mean, how were you able to feel the worth God gave you as his worker? Is there anything that maybe you could think of there as we talk about that? Because I really think that's at the core of what I was trying to say is God gave us, assigned us a purpose and a worth and a particular role in achieving things.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask it that question and ask it that way, because it leads me to, or it reminds me of, I mentioned earlier have a couple of stories ready for your sport appointments. And the one story I always tell is how I would always show the strategic nature of my specific role in the kingdom. And it was a vision, an actual God-given vision that one of our staff members received. She was the first believer in her family. She's from a different culture and in which the gospel was not prevalent. And shortly after becoming a believer, the Lord gave her a vision. And in this vision, she sees herself walking down the beach at sunset. And she looks out over the ocean and she sees somebody drowning. And panic and dread sets in. And she's like, okay, I've got to get out there. She starts to prepare. I've got to jump in the water. I've got to save this person. And then she scans the horizon, realizes it's not just one. It's tens of thousands, millions, in fact, billions of people drowning in the ocean. And her panic and excitement is quickly squashed, and she doesn't know what to do. Well, she looks down the beach a little further and she realizes down the beach there are hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of believers worshiping. The only problem is all of their backs are turned to the ocean. And she realizes in that moment, I know what I need to do. She goes tearing down the beach, full sprint, gets to the first person she can find and grabs him by the shoulders, turns him around, points him to the ocean, says, we've got to get out there. Next thing you know, she's turning around people. There's people diving in the water. There's people setting up a first aid station. There's all these things that start happening. And that's a quick version of that story, but that's how I showed, that's an example of how you can show the value of your position, even if you are a support staff, even if you are an administrative worker or a finance person. You are playing a part in turning those people around and pointing them towards those that are drowning. You may not be the rescue swimmer in the water, but maybe you're the one setting up the aid station on the beach, or maybe you're the one turning people around. Each of those roles can't operate on their own, just like my role as a mobilizer in Texas. I can't just mobilize people to nothing. I've got to mobilize them to a cause, and I have people in the field that receive them and all these things. So I think that it's one of the stories I love to share to describe that value that I see in it.
But that's a remarkable story, Robert. I mean, and I'm just thinking about it a little. I got a little tingly, and I'm like, well, but that is the way the Lord sees us. And what's it going to take for us to believe that He's got a role for each of us and to accept it? And to own it and walk in faith. And that, like I was thinking, one of the phrases I used a long time ago was, there is no JV in the kingdom of God. If you're a sports person, like there is no junior varsity, like we're on the team, like God has called us, we're all playing. There's no spectators in this. There's no, and we're all important. And I'd love for our listeners, I just wonder what's keeping you from embracing that idea that you are on the team. Like God has called you, he's given you matter to the kingdom. Well, this has been great, Robert. really good stuff. Like I said, these are always fun because you never know exactly where they're going to go. But any final thoughts just on this that you might leave our listeners with?
I would say, I imagine many of you listening to this, or those that will listen to this, Lord willing, I imagine many of you are starting your journey or maybe caught in a slow season of support raising. There's some frustration, there's some bitterness, maybe even. Know that it is possible, first of all. But second, I do encourage you to press pause. Not stop support raising, but press pause in the busyness of your life. Slow down, invite the Lord into this, because you cannot, I urge you not to operate on your own power. I've done that far too many times in my own ministry. You'd think I'd learn the lesson, but I have to keep coming back to that, because it's so tempting to want to do it on your own knowledge and power, but you truly cannot do this alone. You truly need the Lord to be the center of it, to be the fuel of it, to be your sustaining drive. So I ask that each of you slow down and you find that space to invite the Lord in and ask the questions that the Lord has you ask. So,
yeah, great last word there. Thanks again for being our guest today. And guys in the audience, just remember, examine those voices of doubts. Evaluate where you are a little fearful, trepidatious. Move to a spot of pause. I love that Robert offered that to us, and remembering that the confidence comes from the Lord. And then as you move a little bit forward, focus on why God has called you specifically and how you uniquely contribute, and trust that he means it. And I would even ask, somebody pray that he would show you. I think he does give clarity, and you might not have a vision quite as compelling, but maybe you'll have one even more compelling than that, that Robert shared, but trust that he will show you why you matter to the vision you've been called to. Thanks guys for being such faithful followers of SRS, and we appreciate you tuning in and listening, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for joining us today, and please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode as we work to give more insight into building and maintaining your ministry partnership team.